Here to speak with us about what comes next following this wave of violence is Elliot Young, a professor at Lewis and Clark College. One of his areas of expertise is gangs and cartels. Thanks for joining us, Professor Young.
Sure, happy to be here.
Help us understand the scope of this cartel's power and influence in Mexico.
So the CJNG is a cartel that emerged around 2010. It's a split off from another major cartel, the Sinaloa cartel. And right now it is one of the top cartels in the country, and it's known for its use of extreme violence and brutality. It is heavily armed. They have tanks, they have rocket launchers, and they wear full military gear. So they're essentially another military within Mexico that oftentimes outpowers and overpowers the Mexican government.
You mentioned their power. What does it mean for people who live in Jalisco and other places where this cartel and other cartels have that level of power?
Essentially, in the areas they control, they are the government. So clearly in the cities, the Mexican state has a presence, but in the rural communities where they operate, they are the law. They impose taxes on people by forcing them to give them money. They create social order, imposing discipline on people who violate their rules. And they force people into drug trafficking. They force people into human trafficking and other illegal activities.
When you look at the cartel and the government, have these cartels infiltrated the government? Are they members of the government, or have they paid off the government? What's the relationship between the cartels and the Mexican government?
So there's a long history of corruption in the Mexican government, and this will happen at the local level with police officers, where essentially they give the option of what they call plata or plomo, silver or lead. So you take the money as a bribe, or we will shoot and kill you. And most rational people will choose the money rather than having them and their families be killed. But the corruption doesn't just exist at the local level. It goes up to the judiciary. At one point, the drug czar in Mexico, sitting in the equivalent of the White House in Mexico, it was later found was working directly with the cartels. So you see that kind of corruption from the very lowest levels of government all the way up to the top, which makes it very hard to effectively fight drug trafficking in Mexico.
Let's talk about this cartel's influence in the U.S. What can you tell us about that?
So the CJNG, like many of the major cartels, are transnational organizations. They have members in many Latin American countries. They also have people in the United States who they use to traffic the drugs into the United States. Some people have argued they exist in all 50 states. I don't know if that's true or not, but they do have a presence in the United States.
In the nexus, it seems, the cartel's main book of business is the drugs, and in the U.S. you have the demand. Is that the connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, when people hear about the kind of violence and drug trafficking in Mexico, they tend to focus on Mexico as the problem. Clearly, there is a problem in Mexico, but if we look at the source of that problem, the source of the problem is the demand coming from the United States of drug addiction in this country. And that is something I think that is probably a more important way to try to address this problem is the source of the problem, which is drug addiction, which is, in my mind, a public health issue.
It's been confirmed that the U.S. provided intelligence that helped Mexican authorities track Mencho and ultimately kill him. Do you think this collaboration between the U.S. and Mexican government is good or bad for addressing the drug trafficking and the cartel violence?
Well, we have to try to understand what are the motives of the U.S. government. Clearly, there is some effort to try to intercept, interdict drug traffickers coming from Latin America. But at the same time, a few months ago, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, pardoned former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of drug trafficking. And so if we are trying to stop drug traffickers, why is the president pardoning a major drug trafficker. A few years ago in 2020, there was an arrest of a former defense minister from Mexico in Los Angeles. He was arrested on charges of drug trafficking. The Mexican government then petitioned for him to be extradited back to Mexico. The Biden administration did that, and then he was released in Mexico without any prosecution. So there seems to be them playing both sides of the game, going after drug traffickers on the one hand, and then pardoning, releasing convicted drug traffickers on the other hand. And the other thing I would mention is the recent shooting of and killing of people on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific by the U.S. military. That is completely against international law. There were no trials. There was no attempt to capture them. So I think that actually undermines the legitimacy of the United States in the Americas and in the world, and that if we want to go after drug traffickers, it should be done through the judicial system by arresting people, bringing them to trial. But at the same time, if we're releasing people who've already been convicted in the United States, it makes the United States look hypocritical.
What can the U.S. do to prevent drug trafficking and end it?
Well, I think there are a few things they could do. One is by focusing on the source of the problem, which is the public health problem of drug addiction. So we could focus more on treatment efforts in this country, the causes, why are so many people in this country so desperate to get fentanyl that we see in Portland, we see throughout the country. I think the other way to solve this problem is by turning what is an illicit, illegal activity into a legal, above-board activity. You used to have tremendous violence in this country in the 1920s around alcohol, when alcohol was made illegal. We know that by legalizing these trades, it brings it into the open and it reduces the violence, because the violence is due to its criminalization. Now, I know a lot of people would resist the idea of legalizing, especially hard drugs, but other countries such as Portugal and Europe and other countries have experimented with this, and the focus on treatment rather than on criminalization has been successful in those countries. I think we've tried the criminalization, we've tried the military options, and they have only produced more violence. So I think it's time we try other alternatives.
I don't want to diverge too much from the cartel conversation. Portugal is interesting. They obviously have a strong social pressure against using drugs. They have legalized. We saw what happened in Oregon and the heartburn that gave some people. Your position is obviously people are using drugs while they're illegal. If there was a more legal manner they could do it, it would eliminate some of this violence happening like we see in Mexico.
Well, if we think back to the discussion, the rhetoric around the legalization of cannabis in Oregon, there were all kinds of doomsday scenarios. People would be running around high, and there'd be all sorts of problems caused by it. Legalization has happened, and for the most part, it's been uneventful. So you have a legal marijuana trade, it's taxed. Hopefully some of that money from those taxes can go into drug addiction and treatment programs. But we have other drugs that are perfectly legal, like alcohol, which we know also cause lots of problems. So I think rather than seeing this as a moral issue, we should see drug addiction as a public health issue and focus on that. And I think that in that way we would eliminate some of the harms that come from criminalizing drugs and alcohol, which leads to an enormous number of people ending up in prison, which further harms them, harms their family, and doesn't end up treating the root cause of the problem, which is drug addiction.
What nexus do you see, if any, between addressing unlawful border crossings and preventing drug trafficking?
So I think these two things are not as related as most people would think. With multi-billions of dollars of profits to be made in the drug trade, the drug traffickers will always find a way to bring drugs in. They bring them in across land, they bring them in by sea, by air. We have hundreds of thousands of vehicles crossing every day. There's absolutely no way that the Border Patrol can inspect each and every car. The drug traffickers know a certain number of their vehicles will be stopped, and that's just the cost of doing business. So we're not going to prevent drugs from coming in. It's a fantasy to think that we could close the border to drugs. There are people who are obviously trying to cross the border clandestinely without documentation. I think that's a separate issue from drug trafficking, and the overlap or the overlap that some people try to argue between people who are migrants coming in to look for jobs and drug trafficking, I think, is erroneous.
Do you think there's any concern there will be continued violence based off El Mencho's death and what happened?
Absolutely. What we've seen since 2006, when Mexico declared its drug war, arrested major leaders of drug cartels, is that only led to increased violence in the country. Since then, every year, 25,000 to 30,000 Mexicans have been killed in the country, largely due to the drug war. In addition to that, over 100,000 people have been disappeared, presumably killed in this drug war. So what I think we're likely to see, although it might not happen in the next few days, next few weeks, is fighting by people within the Jalisco cartel for control over that cartel, or fighting from rival cartels over the territory that they once controlled. So it might lead to applause in the State of the Union address that they captured El Mencho, but the future for violence in Mexico, that situation is not likely to have improved. And in fact, we've probably exacerbated the problem of violence in Mexico as a result of this.
Is that what concerns you most?
Yeah, I mean, I am concerned, of course, for my fellow Oregonians and U.S. citizens who are in Puerto Vallarta and other tourist sites who've had to be locked down, who've had their flights canceled. But my biggest concern is for Mexicans who are being targeted, being forcibly recruited by these cartels, caught in the crossfire, and end up dying in enormous numbers as a result of the situation of drug trafficking in Mexico.
I want to ask you one more question related to that, because when people hear, oh, the cartels will fight, there might be a reaction, well, those are willing participants in the cartel, they're fighting each other. Not who cares, but it's two sides that are actively engaged. You outlined it earlier. I just wonder how the average Mexican can get caught up in that, either in the crossfire or how they get affected by violence between cartels.
Sure. Well, one, you could get caught up in the crossfire, but cartels are not operating just among the people who are their members. They go out and they forcibly recruit people, vulnerable members of the community, often migrants from other Central American countries who are coming through the country, members of the LGBT community, women, any vulnerable member of the community, drug cartels will use to forcibly recruit them to help traffic drugs or engage in human trafficking or other illicit activities. So those people don't have a choice, and they end up getting caught up in this. And then once you're caught up in that trafficking, you're facing violence and criminalization by the state, as well as violence by the cartels. The other way that I think the average Mexican citizen is caught up in the violence of drug traffickers is simply by the fact that you have this alternative state which has essentially eroded the democratic institutions in Mexico. So they can't rely on the Mexican government to provide education, to provide health, to provide welfare, and so they end up relying on drug trafficking organizations to do the functions of the state where they live. And that means that you're living in a place where you're not actually protected by your government, which is a very scary and dangerous position to be in.
Professor Elliot Young from Lewis and Clark College, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.